What was your reaction when you heard that you had, in fact, landed this plum role?
I wasn't prepared for yes, so I sat there kind of quietly for about 20 minutes just trying to work out how to feel.
There's a lot of pressure to really put your own mark on it. How did you take this character, Superman, and make him less of a comic book character and make him more multi-dimensional?
Personally, I wanted to apply a very real-world feeling of that loneliness. That's what Clark experiences. He's spent his entire life without one person empathizing with him. His two adopted parents sympathize, but they have no answers. They have no idea how he feels. Having to watch the world go by and try and work out why people do what they do and what their reaction would be to you if they discovered any part of you. That's what I applied to the character, and you see a bit of that in Clark, or a lot of that in Clark.
What I wanted to do was just go straight to the source material and do as much justice to that character in there as opposed to the character in the heart and souls of everyone, because that could be a little weighty.
We all have our set of movie characters who resonate with us the most, the protagonists we connect with above all the rest, whose stories we become engrossed in on a deeper level because we care about what happens to them. I don't think my favorites are any secret. I mean, come on, James Bond, Bruce Wayne, Dom Cobb. Watching the films centered around them created this instant bond, one which has stuck with me for years, even decades afterwards. But there's one character in particular who resonates deeply with me, who it took a bit of time to really fall in love with in the same way. I don't remember a time I was ever unaware of Superman. Who does? And I always enjoyed the Christopher Reeve movies growing up for what they were. But beyond the spectacle, beyond how impressed I was with Christopher Reeve's performance, I was always a step or two short of truly feeling connected to Superman. And it's not like I was a massive fan or avid reader of the Superman comics either. Superman has just never really done it for me. I don't know if it's because he's basically what you think of when you think of a superhero. He's almost so derivative and generic, even though that's like, that's just the character, that's just the way it is. But I don't know, it's just Superman was never really one of my favorites growing up. Now, those of you who are longtime viewers know, and by long time I mean you probably clicked on the video right before this and heard me mention it about a dozen times or so, but that Christopher Nolan is my favorite filmmaker of all time, and he has been ever since I was a kid. The Dark Knight trilogy was massively influential for me in my love of cinema, and simply put, it revolutionized the way we all collectively view comic book movies. To me, those movies get to the heart of Batman and what he represents on a macro level to so many of us in a way that supersedes the comic book genre itself. He meditates on broad, deeply instinctual human emotions using our favorite heroes as the symbols to convey the message. While undoubtedly a remarkable visual storyteller, I mean, he's probably one of, if not the best, Nolan has a distinct penchant for narrative that stems from his own literary introspection and elevated thinking, which allowed him to revolutionize Batman. And then there's Zack Snyder. Oh, Zaddy! Yeah. I was drawn to Snyder initially by his mastery of film's visual language. He's an incredibly distinct visual storyteller. He manages to make even something relatively low-key like the ticking of a watch or as simple as a game-winning touchdown in a football game feel massive and epic, like it's the most important thing you could be watching at that point in time, and you can't turn away from it. It just sticks with you. Snyder's strengths are his visuals, and however it happened, he discovered the secret to translating comic book panels to the screen in a way that's evocative but doesn't lose its impact. I was on a major Snyder kick in high school. Hell, even before high school. I just adored all of his movies, and they left an imprint on me. And yeah, you know what? They were just fucking interesting and badass. For some unexplainable reason, please don't ask me, I have no idea. My love of their respective works led me to wanting the two of these absolute legends to collaborate on a project. Again, don't ask me why, it makes no sense. All I know is I wanted them to come together on a project before I really understood that that's not how filmmaking really works. You know, two directors don't usually come together and collaborate on a movie, especially when their styles are so diametrically opposed in this case. And yet, my wishes came true anyway. In 2013, in the form of a masterpiece that not only inaugurated a cinematic universe, it completely changed the way I looked at Clark Kent and, in turn, the way I looked at Superman. Man of Steel was and always will be my Superman film. It's the movie that unlocked my ability to understand what he means and represents for so many of us, because Zack Snyder strove to ensure that we spent the first hour of this film understanding how Kal-El became Clark Kent, and how Clark Kent became a man, before we ever saw Henry Cavill step out in the iconic blue and red. And yet, in tandem with accomplishing this, Snyder never lost sight of the spectacle and wonder of Superman. What made me realize I love Superman is this weird alchemy when you combine Nolan and Snyder, two filmmakers that feel like they couldn't be any more different from one another, but when brought together, equals the ultimate superhero movie. Maybe not my favorite per se, but certainly one of the best, and one of my favorites. Anyway, so Man of Steel was really this perfect storm of my favorite storytellers, a type of storytelling I loved, coming together to help me fall in love with a character I struggled previously to fully get on board with. Christopher Nolan and Zack Snyder created something that allowed me to believe in the power of Superman, in the truth and necessity of what he stands for. And for as much of a masterpiece as this movie is on the surface, that is what has stuck with me the most through all these years since. Man of Steel represents the triumphant return of the character to the big screen in 25 years. Yeah, I know, it seems crazy, right? That we didn't get a Superman movie in that entire time frame. It's crazy. Wild that there was not another Superman movie. But now it seems like the character is here to stay. And especially now that Cavill is officially back to bring us more of my Superman, I see no better time to celebrate the masterpiece that is Man of Steel. Right from its prologue on Krypton, Man of Steel announces itself as a Zack Snyder movie, right down to the council looking like something torn out of the frames of 300. It's sheer spectacle, an entire world burned into our minds cinematically in the distinct way that only Snyder can provide. It's kind of wild that we spend nearly half an hour here, learning Krypton, getting to know its key figures and political turmoil intimately. Like, every time I go back and visit this film, the Krypton stuff breezes by, and then I'm like, oh, that's like a quarter of the movie. What? How? What? Makes no sense. Needless to say, Zack Attack knows how to hold an audience in the palm of his hands. It's all so urgent and breathtaking, yet a tragic warning to Clark, to the audience, to humanity, to be better than Krypton, for we may ultimately suffer a similar fate. The hopes and dreams of two activists, Jor-El and Lara, who ultimately failed to convince their people, their leaders, to do better, be better, make a change, and save their world. Krypton is a cautionary tale, and the twilight hours of its existence, the perfect place to start our journey. Its dying breath, a plea to listen to our planet, both ecologically and to the people suffering in need of help. The plot of Man of Steel, of Zod's desperation to create a new Krypton after his home was destroyed, is established here. And then it's set aside for its story, which is a story about a boy named Clark who grows into a man who finds his true purpose. We come back down to earth, and that's when Christopher Nolan's sensibilities, where his story by credit and everything I love about the way he views cinema all come in at once. Structurally, with the vignettes, it's similar to Batman Begins, weaving the cross-cutting in between Clark Kent's past and present. And sure, Nolan is a bit more effective at orchestrating that structure because he thrives in the non-linear. Comparing the two origin stories, the flashbacks in Batman Begins feel like they're more for the audience, whereas in Man of Steel, Steel, they definitely feel like they're for Clark and musing on his loneliness. Bruce has a fire, a passion, a drive, a purpose, even if it's initially directed at the wrong thing, at thirst for revenge for the death of his parents. Clark, on the other hand, arrives to us in a very different place. He's not imprisoned, on the run, or driven. He's a drifter, a wanderer, a soft-spoken man without a purpose or sense of direction. Actually, he has no idea what the fuck he's doing. His wandering and soul-searching has led to isolation, and so that wistful, melancholic coldness is represented through the atmosphere, tone, color, and score. The film actually seems to warm up as Clark himself has an epiphany as to what his purpose is. The meditation and journey of identity put forth by Nolan and David Goyer is beautifully paired with Snyder's distinct knack for visual storytelling. Visual storytelling centered around mood. Look at all of Zack Snyder's strongest scenes. The birth of Dr. Manhattan, Cyborg's origin, the beautiful lie opening of BVS. I mean, shit, the entirety of 300 even. I'd argue they're the most effective because they aren't barred by language or nationality, but instead, like any great filmmaker, uses the language of the medium and takes advantage of Snyder's unmatched eye for artistically striking and emotionally evocative visuals. Again, that's not to say that Nolan also doesn't possess the same skill set, because fuck yeah he does, but there's splash page comic panel levels of iconography that Snyder employs that suits this particular story and character nicely. Anyway, this gradual warming of mood and tone is arguably one of the best examples in the film of the two auteurs and their respective skill sets working in tandem with one another. Batman is constant purpose. He's a man driven by having watched his parents die, whereas Superman is someone who has to find his way there. Even some of the Reeve films are like this, where Superman has to find himself. Superman knows he wants to help people, he cares about people, but he doesn't know what the right way to go about doing it is, and I genuinely don't know if any other filmmaker who's tackled Superman gets that as deeply as Nolan and Snyder. We're so used to Superman the icon, the pastiche, the stereotype that most interpretations post-Donner cut have divulged into. Man of Steel marked the first time we examined Superman as one of us, as human, as Clark Kent. Both films, of course, were scored by the master maestro himself, Hans fucking Zimmer. Y'all know I love me some Hans Zimmer, and I love Zimmer's Nolan music, but to me, Man of Steel remains his magnum opus. Yeah, you heard me right, even better than Dune. And, you know, Dune's pretty fucking perfect, but gee, listen to this. This is, wow. Just blows my mind. I can't, Hans, you goddamn mastermind. Clark's journey is represented beautifully through Hans's music, through these very airy, ethereal sounds, synth pads, with muffled echoes of what will become Superman's theme in this universe. Then, as the film progresses and it becomes less of an isolated, lonely journey, piano comes in. As he becomes more one with humanity, more and more orchestral elements are layered in, and it builds into what eventually becomes the full-blown Superman theme that plays out at the end of the film. I'm not saying that this is a mind-blowingly unique approach. I mean, really, this effect in general should be film scoring 101, and it's certainly not something Zimmer suddenly started doing with this film. I just think it is so goddamn effective when paired with the moody visuals of Snyder and Nolan's storytelling instincts. It's just some of the most chill-inducing, spectacularly epic and gorgeous work the man has ever done. He essentially orchestrates a goddamn rock opera to godlike proportions. And you know, I could go on about the greatness of the Man of Steel score all day, but what's most Dark Knight-like, most Nolan-esque about Man of Steel is how all the characters feel like avatars for bigger ideas. No, not that avatar. Not yet. That's coming soon. No, not that. Zod represents a bigger concept than just crazy general gone rogue. Superman represents a symbol of hope pulled between these two competing cultural ideas, which is very in line with Nolan's Batman trilogy, where Batman, Joker, and Bane are all representative of larger ideas and themes. Again, this is something that Nolan has been doing across all of his movies, but it's just really felt in his Batman films. Even Batman v Superman, without Nolan's involvement, still gets into the machinations of the competing parties, which feels like a connection to Nolan's work here, as if it rubbed off on Snyder. You just naturally feel Christopher Nolan's touch, even if you forget he has a story by credit, guided by his instincts as a storyteller. And I find it interesting that what divides people about the film is Snyder's contributions, the stylized spectacle, whereas Nolan's story is generally well regarded. Well, I know a lot of people didn't really like the vignettes, but you know what? You liked it in Batman Begins, so go to hell. It illustrates how involved Zack Snyder was in shaping the film, even if he wasn't involved from the beginning. It shows he wasn't just a gun for hire in Man of Steel. I mean, like, he maybe started out that way, but it didn't end that way. There's still a ton of him in there, and it's not just on a stylistic level. I actually see him as the perfect director to make an introspective, empathetic Superman film because I see a lot of Clark Kent in Zack Snyder. He's mild-mannered, occasionally awkward, but he's passionate under the shyness. This all comes out in his depiction of Superman, a relation to the gentler and more reserved side of the character. Zack and Henry Cavill shaped a performance that specifically played into the humanity of Superman, and playing it more reserved isn't a bad thing. It feels appropriate to the character. Kal-El is literally a man out of our world, and after his surrogate father dies, one disillusioned with it. It doesn't make sense to play him as broad in the circumstance. Clark Kent needs to be less bumbling, less outwardly expressive than we're used to, with a quieter, much more reserved shyness, which you can trace back to Zack Snyder himself. You get the sense that he encouraged Henry to take the performance in that direction based on his own personality, but also out of a sincere view of who and what Superman is. And let's get real here. He might be built like Superman, but Henry Cavill isn't some brash, boisterous guy either. He's a bit awkward and a pretty big fucking nerd himself if you've ever watched him interviewed, and that's what people love about him. He's incredibly affable, and as a result, he's also playing Clark from a real place. He's not putting on an affect, and the character feels much more real as a result. It's why this is the version of the character that resonates the most with me. It's the exact same reason that Daniel Craig's interpretation of James Bond is the one I enjoy the most too. He's human. Cavill's Superman feels human. That's part of who he is, part of his upbringing, even if his genetic makeup says otherwise. So if Henry Cavill is the Superman of Supermen, I suppose that makes Zack Snyder the Superman, or at the very least the Clark Kent of filmmakers. Because when you actually open up the hood, underneath his affable and reserved exterior, he has the superpower of a limitless imagination and the capacity to bring it fully to life on screen. The action in Man of Steel, oh god, I fucking love the action in this movie. Ugh, it rules so hard. It's jaw-dropping, and it fully realizes the potential Superman's powers have to be visually compelling, something that I don't think we ever really saw before this. Again, I enjoy the Reeve films. Well, I at least thoroughly enjoy the first one and the Donner Cut, but there was a limitation there in the 70s. Yeah, the spectacle is there when Superman flies, but the true force of his powers is something that requires an eye for impact, velocity, immersion, and how to make a pretty fucking cool image. The whole movie is this voyeuristic look and interpretation of Superman. We have to feel the weight of this power, and Man of Steel, as a result, is a complete sensory experience. The ground has to ripple from when he flies off, the skies have to bend, and space has to squish around him as he moves at the speed of light. Snyder captured all of that, and I can't think of another superhero story that has anything close to representing the visual splendor of the comic books on that same level. The Raimi Spider-Man films are probably the closest you get, and that's operating on a very different scale, one much more intimate. The wonder comes to the audience as it comes to Peter Parker because we experience his powers with him and literally at times through his eyes. Man of Steel, on the other hand, makes you believe that you are witnessing Superman come to Earth. And even in the near decade since, nothing compares to how visceral and perfectly depicted the showcase of power, strength, and spectacle is. It's what makes the movie so revolutionary, and I'd argue it was so impactful as to force Marvel to step up what it was doing. Even the Avengers, which came out the year before, is lackluster by comparison, and I like that movie. It's got some great action sequences in it, but it doesn't bring the powers of its heroes to life in interesting ways. The super in the superhero film isn't as extraordinary as it should be or could be. Compare it to Age of Ultron, which came out 2 years after Man of Steel, and for whatever other problems that film might have, and good God, there are many, it undeniably upped the ante in response. That is Snyder's strengths. Love him or hate him, what he's good at is bringing the power behind his spectacle to impactful life. His magnificent eye for visuals. This is a stunning film on any aesthetic metric, and a brain for composing it in a way that's reminiscent of the comics themselves. Snyder worked in advertising for a short time, creating striking imagery for his campaigns, and was an artist and sculptor prior to being a filmmaker. I mean, shit, I think the guy actually went to art school. He always maps out full storyboards before each film, most of which are incredibly detailed, intricate pieces of art in their own right. And whether or not he honed this skill in advertising or he developed it from his youth as an artist, he always had a knack, all the way back to Dawn of the Dead, for finding the most visually exciting way to convey something in a short amount of time, using exciting visuals to communicate abstract ideas rather than focusing on the realism of it all, and that ability has never been put to better use than in his superhero films. Long story short, his visual, vibrant artist's vision is always at the forefront of his mind, and that is Zack Snyder's superpower. That being said, I actually admire how restrained Man of Steel is in comparison to Snyder's other work. Snyder has a reputation for snap zooms, speed ramping, excessive and endless slow-mo, but there's really so little of that here. Well, maybe he still indulges in the occasional snap zoom, but you know what? A snap zoom a couple times an hour is good for your health, it really is. And Snyder has always understood that slow motion isn't necessarily effective for conveying speed on its own, that all you really do in that instance is, well, portray something in slow motion and it's vapid, empty. It just is a cool looking thing with very little weight behind it. And that's why there's so little of it in Man of Steel, because it wouldn't make sense to slow down Clark Kent's light speed flying. We wouldn't be experiencing it the way we would in reality. Slow motion works when it emphasizes the impact such movement would have, which is why it makes sense to show, say, Flash entering the Speed Force in slow-mo. He's literally saving the world by doing so, and the world, by comparison, is moving in slow motion relative to himself, whereas Superman flying at light speed is, well, it's just how he gets around. It doesn't need the extra emphasis for the dual, almost paradoxical reasons that it's already pretty spectacular on its own, while also just being a part of Superman's day-to-day life. And it showcases Snyder's singular ability to convey the environmental and atmospheric impact that would give these movements weight. By comparison, Joss Whedon tried to do this with Quicksilver in Age of Ultron, but it just kinda looks like he's flashing through the world. There's no real weight to his actions or movements. And you have to account for the in-universe context too. This is the very first display of Superman to humanity, their first contact via Kryptonians. Snyder understands that he needed to show it raw and unadulterated, avoiding his regular stylistic trappings so as to allow the audience to experience Superman the same way the citizens of Metropolis would. So for all the accusations Snyder gets about abusing slow motion, I just find it interesting that he has such a solid understanding of when and when not to use it. The same could be said of any of the effects that typify his work. He uses them just like he'd use any other editing tool. It's all pre-planned stuff. very deliberate and well thought out. Zack Snyder is an incredible filmmaker. I think you all know my affinity for him by now, and nowhere is that more apparent than in Man of Steel. And I can hear it now. Restraint? Really? But Superman destroys a city. It's a bad choice. Look at all the destruction. It's like disaster porn. Look, the destruction critique is, God, I really don't want to get into this, but gotta do what you gotta do. I'll be polite and just say that I don't agree with that critique. It's trivial for a lot of reasons, but particularly when you consider that up until the big action, everything is there to represent a bigger idea than what's on screen. It's not about Superman saving individuals, he's saving humanity. He's fighting for humanity. The film explicitly conveys that. He's only just learning his abilities, and he's trying to stop a threat that is on the verge of destroying Earth. A threat which will exist as long as Zod is there to uphold it. So why does he have to save that one family in the station? Why does he have to snap Zod's neck? Because he can. Because he can directly stop Zod from harming them. But most of all, because that family represents something larger. They represent humankind, and Zod represents Kryptonian kind. And in that moment, Superman chooses to save mankind and reject Krypton. Zod exists as a foil to both Jor-El and Jonathan Kent. Jor-El wants Kal-El to go to Earth and guide the people so they don't make the same mistakes as Krypton, while Zod wants Kal-El to forsake Earth and rebuild Krypton because of his, Kryptonian supremacy complex. Likewise, Jonathan tethers Clark to Earth, while Zod challenges that connection, throwing it into direct conflict with his newfound connection to Krypton. Superman's battle with Zod is ultimately not supposed to be a literal depiction of people in Metropolis dying. What casualties do happen are caused by Zod and his machine, and just because Dawn of Justice made it about that, something which I feel wouldn't have been the case had people not reacted the way they had to Man of Steel. I mean, look, you wouldn't get a line like, "It's uninhabited" in BVS if it wasn't for the destruction complaints in this film. But it doesn't change the fact that this whole fight, this whole incident, is about bigger ideals than the little instances of violence. It's about saving the entire planet, not just someone in a building. Given how centered the film is on Clark's perspective and how it's using its characters to touch on larger ideas, it makes sense that the third act battle with the Kryptonians would focus on Clark's tunnel vision, his perspective in the actual fight. When in the midst of a fight, you aren't stopping to think about all the damage you're causing, you're just trying to stop the force that's coming at you. Yes, you can be careful, but sometimes accidents happen, and when you're a superhuman battling another superhuman for the fate of the planet, there's going to be collateral damage, even if it's not necessarily what Clark wants to have happen. This POV is juxtaposed with wide ground-level shots depicting the mass destruction and carnage, so we as the audience have a sense of the scale of this duel. Again, every decision, every shot selection serves a purpose, and when looking at the nature of the story, I don't think it's particularly about the little instances of violence. It's about the big picture. Remember, Snyder likes to draw from mythic, epic storytelling, and so the details of that isn't necessarily what he's going to focus on. He's going to fight on this epic battle of good versus evil for the preservation of humankind. And look, if we really want to get down to it, at the most basic level, Snyder just also thinks Superman flying into buildings and having an anime Dragon Ball Z-like fight with Zod is fucking cool, and yeah, he's right. So on all fronts, no, I don't think the Metropolis fight is bad or unreasonable, and I also think it's much more Zod's fault than it is Superman's, so if anything, that only justifies Superman killing Zod to bring an end to the destruction and collateral damage. God, I really hate that I had to discuss that, but you just have to. You have to every single time you talk about Man of Steel. I think you ultimately need to look at Man of Steel as a character piece to understand it. The first two acts of the film are the movie. The third act, the whole showdown in Metropolis, is an affirmation of it. And while it's undeniably a movie, the movie about Clark Kent, I think Man of Steel treats its other main characters with a lot of care and depth. First of all, Lawrence Fishburne as Perry White is some of the most genius casting I have quite frankly ever seen, and he is a scene stealer. But he's not the only scene stealer working at the Daily Planet. It's great that Lois Lane is in on the secret about Clark Kent's true identity right from the get-go. It's a nice subversion of an annoying, dated trope of the character from the beginning of time where she can't tell the difference between this man she sees up close 5 days a week and the most famous person on Earth who also happens to save her life repeatedly, just because of a pair of glasses. Now, if the rest of the characters could stop falling for it as well, that'd be fucking great. But baby steps, right? It also makes Lois seem like a better journalist, someone who's incredibly competent and excelling at her job, while also allowing her to be more a part of Clark's journey. It allows that relationship to develop from the get-go instead of her just fawning over Superman, which is funny, sure, but is also kind of a disservice to the character. And don't get me wrong, Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder portray the Lois Clark dynamic perfectly, and there's not much to improve, so you know what the solution is? Don't fix what isn't broke. But Man of Steel still modernized their relationship by jumping ahead to where she knows who Clark really is from the jump. And if you do a story that emphasizes Clark's loneliness, it makes perfect sense to flesh out the supporting cast in that way, to emphasize how they see and know Clark Kent. Clark is a wanderer, but he's not sad. He's just kind of content helping people silently. He's alone and aimless before he discovers Superman, but he's never just sad. When it comes to this particular interpretation of Superman, people seem to conflate loneliness with sadness. And yeah, because of the non-linear structure, because of the way events in Clark's adulthood so often recall the most challenging parts of his childhood, it makes it feel a bit more wistful than I think it's supposed to, but that's more for the audience's sake than it is for his. I think the consequence is a misinterpretation of Clark as being sad. But when he starts interacting with Lois and Ma Kent, he's quite warm. During his first flight, he's quite literally on cloud 9, very happy. He's not in a mood the whole time, he just doesn't interact with enough people to really convey it. He's young, it's a coming-of-age story, he just doesn't know what his place is. He's just human. And that search for meaning, of trying to maintain your soul while being at odds with what society intends for you, is something we all experience. We all have a capacity for good, to be the best possible version of ourselves, but it's something that's easier said than done. Clark is caught between worlds, just as so many of us are caught between who we are and who we aspire to be. Man of Steel interrogates this and asks how we can balance the Clark Kent and Superman dichotomy. Given the introspection, we're not going to get the Christopher Reeve's perfect smile and happy demeanor. Why does Clark, and specifically this Clark, have to smile all the time? It's not like Superman's cheesing 24/7. It doesn't make this interpretation dour and depressing, and you've got to remember too that the movie ends on one of the most hopeful, optimistic moments in the DCEU. Notice how I said DCEU, not DCEU, because that's changed now. We're living in the era of the DCU, ladies and gentlemen, thank fuck. And with the Zimmer score, it just soars. Mild-mannered is how Superman's been described in the comics. That's how Cavill plays him. He's friendly if you talk to him, but he keeps to himself otherwise. He's not a youth pastor. He's very introverted. That's why Superman's characterization in Justice League is so off from what we've seen of him prior. It portrays Superman the way people think he should be, rather than how he is. He's not extroverted and bubbly. He's quietly polite. When he gets captured by the military, he's very cordial. He allows himself to be cuffed, explains the S on his suit, breaks his restraints to prove that he's here by choice and that he's a reasonable person. It's a testament to his character, and it makes him feel much more real and human than the nonsensically idealistic way he's been portrayed or how so many other people think Superman should be. It's why I think people have a hard time relating to the character and seeing him more than an archetype, because it's really easy for a guy like that to come across as one note and comical. And the best Superman stories don't. Now, with all that being said, there's a place for lighthearted Superman, and Lord knows we've gotten it plenty of times. But sometimes it's a good idea to earth the character and remind people of the man who wears the cape. And that's why I adore the Jonathan Kent stuff. Jonathan instills the necessity within Clark to hold on to his humanity. Jor-El gives Superman a greater purpose, an objective, an ideal to strive towards. But the character needs both. He's not Superman without both halves of his identity. Jor-El tells him he can accomplish wonders, that he can do incredible things, that he should do incredible things. Jonathan keeps him humble, grounded. If he was guided only by Jor-El, then he'd epitomize the God complex. If he only had Jonathan, he would be someone with an extraplanetary gift that he didn't use for something greater than himself. And that's what makes Man of Steel so goddamn amazing. For as much as the movie is about searching for whether or not Superman belongs here, the answer is a resounding yes. Superman is one of us. He is human, even if he's from another planet. He's for sure an outsider, but he joins us through a humanist lens. He has a very human reaction to finding out he's not human, to losing the most important figure in guiding his humanity. So he spends a lot of the movie soul-searching, searching for meaning, but that's what every person does. That's the human condition. The thing that sets Clark apart from you or me is that his searching for meaning is spurred by the realization that he isn't human. Man of Steel is about recognizing the humanity in one another, in recognizing the humanity in people who are different than us. It's about the influence the people in Superman's life have had on him as a person. He comes to the conclusion at the end that he stands with the people of Earth after having defended them from the last Kryptonians. He is a vessel of Krypton, but not an emissary of its destruction. He is the thing that keeps Krypton alive, ironically, by leaning into his humanity and living among mankind. He affirms Krypton's survival because he rejected Zod, and now he stands as Earth's mightiest protector. And once he finds that purpose, Clark Kent wanders no more. But what happens when that humanity isn't recognized in another? When someone's fears are projected onto a person simply because of their existence?